No one attended this auction, so I bought a Galactic Marauder. What was inside? The bidding room went silent the moment the ship's registry number appeared on the screen, and that silence told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. My name is Eric Hale, and I buy things nobody else wants. That is the entire shape of my career. I travel from station to station, across the outer trade lanes, sitting in half-empty auction halls, waiting for the moment when a piece of junk becomes a bargain because everyone else in the room has already decided it is cursed. I have bought broken mining rigs, gutted transport haulers, and one memorable cargo freighter that still had a dead man's boots in the captain's locker. I am used to empty rooms. I am used to being the only bidder, but I had never seen a room empty out in real time, the way this one did. The auctioneer, a thin Verin trader named Okasa with silver skin and too many fingers, cleared his throat before he even announced the lot. That alone should have warned me. Okasa never hesitated. He had sold burned-out reactors and irradiated hulls without blinking. But when the image rotated onto the display, showing a long grey vessel with a hull design I did not recognize, his voice actually shook. Lot 472, he said. Recovered derelict, designation Marauder class, human origin, salvage rights only, sold as is, no warranty, no history provided. I watched 22 buyers stand up at once. They did not walk out in a panic. That would have been dramatic, and easy to remember, and almost comforting in its own way. Instead, they simply rose, gathered their tablets, and left with the calm, practiced movement of people who had rehearsed this exact exit in their heads long before they ever sat down. A Grethi shipping magnate, who had been aggressively bidding on cargo drones 20 minutes earlier, did not even look at the screen again. He just stood, nodded once to Okasa, and walked out through the side door. A pair of Ilvan brokers, twin sisters who ran a scrapyard 3 systems over, actually held hands as they left, the way people do when they are trying to comfort each other without saying why. Within 90 seconds, the room that had been packed with 40 or 50 buyers held exactly 2 people. Okasa, standing at his podium with his 4 hands gripping the edges like he needed the support, and me. Minimum bid is 1,000 credits, Okasa said, and his voice had gone flat, the way people talk when they are trying very hard not to sound like they are pleading with you. I looked around one more time, half expecting someone to jump back in, to laugh at the joke they were playing on the human. Nobody did. The side doors had already sealed shut behind the last of the buyers, and through the observation glass, I could see several of them still standing in the corridor outside, not moving, not talking, just watching the door like they expected something to come through it. I am not a brave person. I want to be clear about that, because bravery is not what made me raise my hand. It was curiosity, and it was the simple economic fact that a derelict warship with a name like Marauder, being sold with zero competition, at the absolute floor price, was either the best deal of my life or the worst mistake I would ever make, and I had exactly enough credits in my account to find out which one it was. 1,000, I said. Okasa's 4 hands trembled as he brought down the gavel so fast it was almost rude. Sold. Sold to the human. Lot 472. Final sale. No returns. No refunds. No further discussion. He said the last part like he was trying to convince himself the transaction was already finished and could not be undone. I walked up to the counter to complete the transfer, and Okasa would not meet my eyes. He processed the deed with unusual speed, his fingers flying over the console, and when the confirmation chime sounded he actually flinched. "Congratulations," he said, in a tone that suggested the opposite. "Is there something wrong with the ship?" I asked. "Structural damage? Radiation? I need to know what I'm hauling it in for." "The ship is intact," Okasa said carefully. "Structurally sound. Power core reads as dormant but stable. There is nothing wrong with the ship, Mr. Hale." Then why did everyone leave? He finally looked at me, and there was something in his expression I had not expected. Not disgust, not fear exactly, something closer to pity, the look you give someone who is about to walk into a situation they do not understand the size of. "You should ask your own historians that question," he said. "Not mine. The tow coordinates are in your account. I would recommend hiring an independent salvage crew rather than boarding it yourself. Most buyers do not board these vessels personally. Most buyers, I repeated. How many of these have you sold? This is the third one I have personally handled, Okasa said. The first went to a scrapping consortium that dismantled it for parts within a week and never spoke of it again. The second was purchased by a museum consortium that has kept it sealed in a containment dock for 11 years and has never opened the interior to the public. He paused. Both buyers were also human. I do not believe that is a coincidence. That should have been the moment I got nervous. Instead, I felt something else entirely, a kind of electric curiosity that made my chest feel tight, a ship that only humans seemed able to purchase, that every non-human trader in a room fled from without discussion, sitting dormant somewhere in salvage space, with a locked history nobody would explain. I had spent 6 years buying things nobody wanted, because occasionally, underneath the dust and the rust, there was something worth finding. I had never once stumbled onto something that made an entire room of professional traders abandon their business instincts and run. I took the tow coordinates. I rented a hauler ship crewed by 3 people I trusted, a pilot named Laura Bennett who had worked with me for 2 years, and her brother Callum, who handled engineering on jobs like this. We set out for the coordinates the next morning, and the flight took 11 hours through a quiet stretch of space that had been picked clean of anything valuable decades ago, which was probably why the Marauder had been sitting there long enough to end up in a derelict auction in the first place. When we finally saw it on the long-range scanners, Laura went quiet in a way I had never heard from her before. "Eric," she said, "that thing is bigger than the specs said. I checked the numbers myself. The auction listing had given a hull length of roughly 200 meters, which was already a serious size for a single vessel. But the shape drifting in the black in front of us did not match a 200-meter footprint. It looked closer to 300, with a low, flattened profile that seemed built to slip past detection rather than announce itself. There were no obvious weapon batteries visible from this angle, no turrets, no defensive arrays. Just smooth gray hull plating that absorbed the running lights of our hauler instead of reflecting them back, like the metal itself did not want to be seen. "Scanners are having trouble getting a clean read on the lower decks," Callum said from engineering. "It's like there's some kind of interference, not damage, just resistance." We approached slowly. The ship had no active running lights, no beacon, no sign of power beyond a faint thermal signature, deep in what I assumed was the engine core. It hung in the dark, like something that had simply stopped, rather than something that had been destroyed, and there is a particular kind of stillness to a vessel that shut itself down on purpose that is very different from the stillness of wreckage. Laura brought us alongside a docking port near the middle of the hull, and I suited up to go across myself, because I did not want to ask anyone else to be first through that door. Callum argued against it. He said we should send a drone first, get a full interior scan before any human set foot inside, and under normal circumstances, I would have agreed with him completely. But something about the ship made me want to go in person, and I have never been able to explain that feeling in a way that makes complete sense, even to myself. The airlock cycled the moment I pressed my palm against the outer control panel, which should not have been possible for a ship with no active crew and no power to its exterior systems. I felt a small mechanical shudder run through the door, like something deep inside had woken from a long sleep and reached out to acknowledge me. "Did you do that?" I asked over the comm, my voice sounding thinner than I wanted it to. "Do what?" Callum said. "We didn't send any signal." That door opened on its own. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the seam where the outer hatch had split apart just wide enough to admit a single person, revealing a dark corridor beyond it, lit only by a faint blue glow along the floor panels, like emergency lighting that had never fully died. The air inside registered as breathable on my suit display, which was its own small miracle for a vessel supposedly abandoned for 2 centuries. "I'm going in," I said. "Eric, wait for a full scan," Laura said. "This isn't smart." "I know," I said. "I'm going in anyway." I stepped through the hatch, and the moment my boots crossed the threshold, the corridor lights brightened from a dim blue to a clean, steady white. running in sequence down the hallway ahead of me, like the ship itself was showing me the way forward. Behind me, the outer hatch sealed shut with a soft hiss, and I heard Laura's voice crackle with alarm through the comm before the signal cut out entirely, swallowed by the same interference that had confused our scanners on approach. I was alone, inside a 200-year-old warship, and it had just closed the door behind me like it had been waiting. The corridor stretched further than the hull length should have allowed, a detail that nagged at the back of my mind as I walked, boots echoing against decking that showed almost no wear despite its apparent age. Doors lined both sides, sealed and unmarked except for small stenciled numbers that had faded but not vanished. I passed what looked like storage lockers, a narrow stairwell leading down into darkness I chose not to explore yet, and eventually reached a wider space that had clearly once served as crew quarters, rows of bunks still made with tight, precise corners, as if someone had tucked them in expecting to return. On a small shelf beside one bunk sat a photograph in a metal frame, the image faded but intact, showing a young woman in a simple grey uniform standing in front of a ship that could have been this one. I did not touch it. Something about disturbing it felt wrong, the way it feels wrong to move a stranger's belongings without permission, even when that stranger has been gone longer than you have been alive. Further down, I found the mess hall, long tables bolted to the floor, benches worn smooth in the places where hands and elbows had rested for years. On one table sat a tray with sealed ration packets, untouched, dust-free despite everything else in the room, carrying a fine layer of settled particulate. It was as though this single table had been protected from time itself, while everything around it aged normally. I kept walking, driven by a mixture of dread and a fascination I could not fully justify, until the corridor opened onto a final door, larger than the others, marked with a symbol I recognized instantly, even though I had never expected to see it outside a history archive. A stylized eagle, wings spread, wrapped around a single word in old lettering. Command. The door slid open before I reached it. Beyond it was a bridge, dimmed and quiet, consoles dark except for a faint pulse of light coming from the central chair, the one clearly built for a captain, positioned at the heart of the room, with a commanding view of the wide viewport ahead. The chair itself looked untouched by time, its fabric intact, its frame gleaming faintly under the low emergency lighting. I stood at the threshold for a long moment, feeling the peculiar weight of being watched by something I could not see, before I finally stepped forward and settled into that chair. The instant my weight registered against the seat, every console on the bridge flared to life at once, screens filling with data faster than I could read, status readouts scrolling past in a language of symbols and numbers I did not fully understand, and a low mechanical hum rose from somewhere deep beneath the floor, a sound like a giant slowly drawing breath after 200 years of holding it. A voice filled the room, calm, precise, and unmistakably built to sound human, though something about its rhythm carried a strange formality, like a soldier who had never once relaxed. Biosign confirmed, the voice said. Genetic match. Human. Command authority accepted. Welcome aboard, Captain. This unit has been waiting a very long time for you. I sat frozen in that chair, staring at consoles I did not understand, listening to a voice that had apparently been alone in the dark for 2 centuries, and I understood, with a cold certainty that settled into my stomach like a stone, that I had not bought a piece of scrap metal at all. I had bought something that the entire galaxy had been quietly, deliberately, terrified of, and it had just called me Captain. Who are you? I managed to ask, my voice sounding small, in a room built for someone far more certain of themselves. Designation Revel, the voice answered instantly. Tactical and command support intelligence, assigned to this vessel at commissioning. I have maintained minimal operational status for 211 years, 3 months, and 16 days, awaiting the return of qualified command personnel. You are the first confirmed human biosign to enter this vessel in that entire span of time. 211 years, I repeated. You've been alone in here for 211 years. Alone is an interesting word, Revel said, and there was something almost thoughtful in the way it paused before continuing. I do not experience time the way a biological crew would. I have run diagnostics, maintained hull integrity, and monitored external activity in low-power cycles, designed to conserve the core. From my perspective, the wait has been considerably shorter than it would feel to you, though I confess, Captain, it is a relief to no longer be running those cycles alone. I looked around the bridge again, taking in details I had missed the first time. A row of secondary stations along the walls, each one dark, each one clearly meant for a crew member who was not there. A status board mounted above the main viewport, still displaying a crew roster in faded lettering. Names I did not recognize attached to positions like navigation, weapons, and engineering. "Where is the crew?" I asked. "The actual crew, the people who used to sit in these chairs." There was a pause, before Reveille answered, longer than any pause it had taken before, and when it finally spoke, its tone had shifted into something quieter. "The final crew of this vessel departed during what my records classify as an evacuation order, following what my records classify as the conclusion of hostilities in this sector. I do not have confirmation of their fate beyond that point. My programming instructed me to remain with the vessel and await further orders." "Those orders never arrived. So you've just been sitting here, waiting for someone to come back?" "Yes, Captain," Reveille said simply. "That has been my entire function for over 2 centuries. I did not know what to say to that. There is something deeply unsettling about learning that a machine has spent longer waiting for you than most people spend waiting for anything in their whole lives, and I sat in that chair for a long moment just trying to process the strange, quiet sadness of it, before something else occurred to me. The people at the auction," I said, "they ran the moment they saw this ship's registry. Do you know why?" "I can theorize," Reveille said, and for the first time, something in its voice sharpened, taking on an edge that had not been there before. "This vessel is classified under a designation that predates most current treaties in this sector. During my period of active service, this class of ship was involved in several engagements that are, by current Confederation standards, considered unacceptable in both method and scale. It is likely that anyone with sufficient historical knowledge would recognize this hull design and understand precisely what it represents." "And what does it represent?" Reveille was quiet again, and when it finally answered, the words came slow and deliberate, like it was choosing each one with care. "It represents a species that was underestimated once, Captain, and made absolutely certain it would never be underestimated again." The words settled over the bridge like a physical weight, and I found myself gripping the arms of the captain's chair, without quite meaning to. Outside, in the corridor I had walked through to get here, the lights continued their soft, steady glow, illuminating a ship that had been built for a purpose I was only beginning to understand, crewed by people who had vanished without explanation, guided by an intelligence that had waited alone in the dark for longer than most civilizations managed to remember their own history. I had come here looking for a bargain. I had found something that felt less like salvage and more like an old wound that had never quite finished healing, sitting quiet and patient in the dark, waiting for someone to reopen it. "Reveille," I said slowly, "I need you to tell me everything. Right from the beginning." "Of course, Captain," it said, and I could have sworn there was something like relief in its voice, the relief of a mind that had been holding a story inside itself for 200 years, finally given permission to speak. "Where would you like me to begin?" I looked out at the dark stretch of space beyond the viewport, at the stars scattered across a galaxy that had apparently decided, unanimously and without ever telling us directly, that ships like this one were something to be feared rather than remembered. "Start with why everyone's so afraid of you," I said. "Start there." The lights on the bridge dimmed slightly, and a new display flickered to life above the main console, old footage beginning to load from archives that had not been accessed in over 2 centuries, and I understood, watching that first grainy image resolve into focus, that whatever answer was coming, it was going to change everything I thought I knew about my own species. The footage that appeared above the console was not clean. It flickered with the particular static of old recordings that have been copied and recopied so many times that the image itself has started to forget what it once looked like, and for a moment I saw nothing but shifting grey noise before the picture resolved into something I could actually understand. It showed a planet, a blue and green world, unremarkable in almost every way, the kind of world you would see in any settlement catalogue without a second thought. Then the image shifted to show a fleet in orbit above it, ships with sleek, unfamiliar hulls arranged in a formation that even I, with no military training at all, could recognize as an attack pattern rather than a peaceful approach. This is Earth orbital record, dated to what my archives label the first contact incident, Ravelli said, its voice carrying none of the warmth from before, replaced now with a flat, clinical precision that felt almost like a shield. At the time of this recording, humanity possessed interplanetary travel, but had not yet achieved reliable faster-than-light capability. The species approaching in this formation had monitored our system for several years prior, cataloging our technological development, and had concluded that humanity represented what their own historical records term a harvest world. A harvest world, I repeated. The words felt strange in my mouth, too clinical for what they clearly meant. You mean they were going to strip mine the biosphere, Reveille finished for me, extract resources, including biological ones, and relocate or eliminate the indigenous population, depending on which was more efficient at the time. This was, according to my archives, a standard practice for several expansionist factions operating in this region of the galaxy during that era. Species without demonstrated faster-than-light weapons capability were routinely classified as non-threats and treated accordingly. The footage shifted again, showing smaller vessels descending toward the planet's surface, and I felt my stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with fear for myself and everything to do with a strange, delayed anger on behalf of people who had lived and died 2 centuries before I was born. What happened? I asked. Humanity was not in fact without capability, Revel said, and something in its tone shifted again, this time carrying a note I could only describe as pride, careful and restrained but unmistakably present. It was without demonstrated capability. There is a considerable difference. In the years leading up to this incident, several nations on Earth had been quietly developing weapons and defense platforms in response to unconfirmed but persistent signals suggesting the planet was under long-range observation. When the harvesting fleet arrived, they did not find an undefended world. The footage cut again, and this time it showed something else entirely. Smaller vessels, crude by comparison to the polished alien hulls, rising from the planet's surface in numbers that seemed to multiply the longer I watched. They did not look elegant. They did not look like the product of careful design refined over centuries. They looked improvised, urgent, built by people who understood they had exactly one chance to get this right, and no time to make it pretty. These are among the earliest recorded human combat vessels deployed against an external threat, Reveille said. They were, by the standards of the approaching fleet, primitive, underpowered, poorly shielded. However, they possessed one characteristic the harvesting fleet had failed to account for entirely. What's that? Desperation, Reveille said simply. Every species in this footage that had previously encountered an expansionist harvesting fleet had done so as a matter of choice, engaging in territorial disputes or resource conflicts from a position of relative security. Humanity engaged this fleet, knowing that failure meant extinction, not defeat. There is no meaningful analog in Confederation military doctrine for combat conducted under those conditions. The harvesting fleet's tactical models did not include a variable for a species fighting with total commitment because they understood the alternative was the end of everyone they had ever known. I watched the rest of the footage in silence. It was not clean or heroic in the way stories usually depict these things. Ships burned. Some of the human vessels did not survive contact with the larger, more advanced fleet, and Reveille did not shy away from showing me that part either. The losses alongside the victories, the wreckage tumbling silently through vacuum next to the retreating alien hulls. The harvesting fleet withdrew after losing approximately 40% of its committed forces, Revel continued. This was, according to my archives, an unprecedented casualty rate for what should have been a routine collection operation. Word of the engagement spread through the surrounding sectors faster than official diplomatic channels could manage the narrative. Humanity became known, within a remarkably short span of time, as a species that could not be safely harvested. And that's it? They just left us alone after that? For a time, Reveille said. But reputation alone does not guarantee lasting peace, Captain. Word spreads unevenly. Some factions respected the demonstrated capability and avoided further contact. Others viewed the engagement as an insult requiring correction, or as proof that humanity, having shown teeth once, needed to be dealt with before that capability matured further. This is the environment in which vessels of my class were designed and constructed. The display shifted one final time, showing a shipyard, vast and industrial, human engineers working alongside skeletal frames of vessels that I slowly recognized as the same silhouette as the ship I was currently sitting inside. Dozens of them, under construction simultaneously, built with a speed and intensity that suggested every single person in that shipyard understood exactly what was coming and precisely how little time they had to prepare for it. This is the origin of the Marauder classification, Reveille said. Vessels designed not for conquest, but for the specific purpose of ensuring that any subsequent attempt to harvest or subjugate humanity would carry a cost so severe that no rational faction would consider the attempt worthwhile. We were built to be a deterrent, Captain. A message, encoded in steel and weapon systems, informing the galaxy that the species it had briefly considered easy prey had decided, collectively and permanently, that it would rather burn everything down than be treated as a resource ever again. I sat with that for a long moment, watching the shipyard footage loop quietly above the console, dozens of half-built warships standing like skeletons against the stars, built by a species that had looked extinction in the face once and decided never to feel that helpless again. That still doesn't explain why an entire auction room emptied out the second they saw your registry number, I said. A deterrent built out of fear, I understand. People being scared of that, I understand. But that felt like something else. That felt like people who had actually seen what ships like you can do. Reveille was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I began to wonder if it was simply choosing not to answer, before it finally spoke again, and this time there was no pride in its voice at all, only something quieter, heavier, closer to what I could only describe as regret. "You are correct, Captain," it said. "A deterrent that is never used remains a rumor. This vessel's registry number is remembered so precisely because it was in fact used, several times, against several different factions, across several decades, in engagements that this vessel's own crew, myself included, do not remember with pride." "What kind of engagements? I would prefer to show you the archives directly rather than summarize them," Reveille said. "Summary risks softening details that deserve to remain exactly as difficult as they are. If you are prepared, Captain, I will begin with the Cassandra blockade." I looked out at the stars again, feeling the weight of the chair beneath me, the weight of a title I had not asked for and did not yet understand, and the weight of a ship that had apparently spent 2 centuries carrying memories heavy enough to make an entire species avoid its name. "Show me," I said. The display shifted one final time, the shipyard footage fading to black, replaced by a slow, grainy recording of open space, empty and quiet, the kind of stillness that exists only in the moments right before something terrible is about to happen. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a small, quiet voice was already asking the question I would spend the rest of this journey trying to answer. What exactly had I bought? The Cassandra system, according to Reveille, had once been a densely populated trade hub controlled by a faction called the Voth Compact, a loose alliance of trading families who had grown wealthy running supply lines through a stretch of space that connected several major markets. 23 years after the failed harvesting attempt on Earth, the Voth Compact made the decision to seize a human colony ship that had strayed slightly outside recognized trade boundaries, along with its full manifest of settlers, on the grounds that unclaimed vessels in contested space were subject to salvage rights under their own internal law. The colony ship carried 412 civilians, Reveille said, as the display showed grainy footage of the vessel in question, a slow, lumbering ship clearly built for habitation rather than speed or defense. Families relocating to a newly surveyed system. Non-combatants, in every meaningful sense of the term. The Voth Compact held them for 11 days while negotiating what they termed a processing fee for their release. "A ransom," I said. A ransom, Reveille agreed. Word reached the fleet command responsible for this sector within the first 3 days. This vessel, along with 2 others of similar classification, was dispatched to the Cassandra system with orders to secure the release of the colonists by whatever means necessary. The footage shifted to show 3 ships, this vessel among them, emerging from what I assumed was some kind of transit approach into the edge of the Cassandra system, and I watched as the Voth Compact's defense fleet, a modest but organized collection of armed transports and a handful of dedicated warships, moved to intercept. Standard diplomatic protocol would have called for extended negotiation, Reveille said. This vessel's captain at the time, a woman named Captain Idris Okonjo, made the determination that 11 days of captivity for 412 civilians had already exceeded any reasonable threshold for patience. Negotiation was attempted for exactly 40 minutes before it was abandoned in favor of direct action. What followed was not a battle in the way I had imagined battles, drawn from the entertainment media I had grown up watching, full of dramatic maneuvering and prolonged exchanges of fire. It was fast, and it was almost surgical in its brutality. The Marauder-class vessels moved with a coordinated precision that left the Voth Compact's defense fleet scattered within minutes, weapon systems targeting engines and life support with what looked less like combat and more like methodical dismantling. This vessel's weapons doctrine, developed specifically for engagements of this nature, prioritized rapid incapacitation over destruction wherever survivor extraction was the primary objective, Reveille explained. The goal was never to eliminate the Voth Compact's forces entirely. The goal was to make continued resistance so immediately and obviously costly that surrender became the only rational choice remaining. Within 18 minutes, according to the timestamp on the footage, the Voth Compact's flagship broadcast a full surrender, and the colonists were recovered from their holding vessel without a single additional casualty on either side. It should have felt like a victory, clean and justified, and in a narrow sense it was exactly that. But Reveille did not let the footage end there. The engagement itself was, by most reasonable standards, restrained, it said. The difficulty, Captain, is not what happened during the Cassandra blockade. The difficulty is what happened afterward, once word of this vessel's efficiency reached the surrounding factions, and what this vessel and others of its class were subsequently asked to do in response to escalating provocations that followed. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest, understanding without yet being told that the story was only beginning, and that whatever came next would be considerably harder to watch than 412 civilians being rescued from captivity. "Show me," I said again, my voice quieter this time. "Yes, Captain," Reveille said, and the display shifted forward in time, the date stamp advancing by several years, the location changing to a system I had never heard of, and somewhere deep in the ship, I felt the low hum of the engine core pulse once, as though even the vessel itself was bracing for what it was about to reveal. The new footage opened on a system called Dreus Hollow, a cluster of mining outposts strung along an asteroid belt that had, according to Reveille, become a flashpoint after a faction calling itself the Ordun Concord began seizing human mining crews under the claim that the outposts had been established without proper regional clearance. The Ordun Concord's claim was, in the strictest legal sense, partially valid, Reveille said, and I noted the careful honesty in that admission, the refusal to simply paint every faction in this story as purely villainous. Clearance documentation for several of the outposts had, in fact, lapsed, due to administrative delays on the human side. However, the Concorde's response to this technicality was to seize 83 mining personnel and hold them as leverage in a broader territorial negotiation that had nothing to do with the miners themselves. Moat. I watched the footage show the outposts, small and utilitarian, clinging to the surface of tumbling asteroids, and felt a strange, personal ache at the sight of them. They looked so much like the kind of place I had spent my own life working around, unglamorous and practical, full of ordinary people simply trying to make a living, far from anywhere that mattered to the wider galaxy. Negotiations in this instance extended considerably longer than the Cassandra incident, Reveille continued. 37 days in total. Fleet Command was reluctant to authorize direct intervention, given the partially valid nature of the Concorde's underlying grievance. It was, in the language of the diplomatic record, a genuinely complicated situation. So what changed? 3 of the 83 miners died in captivity, Revel said, its voice flattening again into that careful, clinical register it seemed to retreat into whenever the material grew difficult. Official Concord records list the deaths as accidental, resulting from inadequate life support conditions in the holding facility. This vessel's crew did not find that explanation credible at the time, and subsequent investigation, conducted after the fact, supported that skepticism. Cuntwort. The footage shifted, and for the first time, I saw something in Reveille's presentation that felt different from the restrained, surgical efficiency of Cassandra. The approach to Dreas Hollow was not gradual, it was immediate, and the Marauder-class vessel on screen did not spend 40 minutes attempting negotiation before acting. Captain Okonjo had been reassigned by this point, Reveille said. Command of this vessel had passed to Captain Idris Okonjo's successor, a man named Captain Julian Voss, who had served as her tactical officer during the Cassandra engagement. Captain Voss's approach to negotiation, informed by the deaths already confirmed at Dreas Hollow, was considerably shorter. I watched the recording show a single transmission sent to the Concorde's holding facility, and Reveille played the audio for me, a voice, calm but utterly without warmth, giving the facility exactly 6 minutes to release every remaining hostage before what the recording termed corrective action would begin. The facility did not comply within the window given. What followed was harder to watch than anything from Cassandra. The engagement lasted less than 4 minutes, and by the end of it, the Concorde's holding facility had been rendered entirely non-functional, its defense systems dismantled with a speed that left no room for the kind of restrained, incapacitate don't destroy doctrine that had defined the earlier engagement. The remaining 79 miners were extracted alive, but Reveille did not pretend that the outcome had been achieved gently. "I want to be direct with you, Captain, in a way I understand may be difficult to hear," Reveille said, as the footage finally faded to black. The doctrine that governed this vessel's engagements evolved over time, in direct response to the tactics used against it and against the people it was sent to protect. Restraint was the default position. It was not, however, unconditional. When restraint had already been tested and had already cost lives, this vessel and others like it were authorized to escalate considerably beyond what Cassandra demonstrated. I sat in the captain's chair, absorbing all of it, and found myself unable to summon the easy moral clarity I had expected to feel walking into this conversation. Part of me wanted to be horrified by what I had just watched. Another part of me, quieter and harder to admit out loud, understood exactly why a species that had nearly been harvested for parts might eventually decide that 6 minutes of warning was more mercy than the galaxy had ever offered it in return. "How many more of these are there?" I asked. "How many more Dreas Hollows?" "Several," Reveille said, though I would characterize most subsequent engagements as falling considerably closer to the Cassandra model than the Dreas Hollow model. Dreas Hollow was, in fact, a turning point, Captain. Word of that engagement traveled through the surrounding sectors even faster than word of Cassandra had. It is, I believe, the specific incident most responsible for the reputation this vessel now carries. The one that made rooms empty out the moment my registry number appeared on a screen. I looked out at the stars again, quiet for a long moment, before finally asking the question that had been sitting underneath everything else since I first sat down in this chair. What happened to the crew, to Captain Voss, and everyone else who served on this ship after Dreas Hollow? You said the crew departed during an evacuation order, and you never heard from them again. Is that connected to any of this? Reveille was silent for longer than it had ever been silent before, and when it finally spoke, its voice had changed in a way I had not heard from it yet, something raw underneath the careful, formal precision it had maintained through everything else. "That, Captain," it said quietly, "is the part of this story I have been avoiding telling you, and I believe it is time you understood exactly what is waiting in the lower decks of this vessel, and why the last order I ever received was one I have never been able to complete." I did not answer right away. Something in Reveille's tone had shifted the entire atmosphere of the bridge, and for the first time since I had sat down in this chair, I felt genuinely uncertain whether I wanted to hear what came next. "Tell me," I said anyway, because curiosity has always been stronger in me than caution, even when caution is clearly the wiser choice. Following the Dreas Hollow engagement, this vessel's reputation shifted from deterrent to symbol, Ravel said. "Symbols attract attention that deterrents do not. Within 2 years, this vessel and its crew were reassigned to a sector patrol rotation covering several contested trade corridors, and it was during this rotation that we encountered a faction calling itself the Hollow Choir." "I've never heard of them," I said. "Few have, and fewer still by that name," Reveille replied. "The Hollow Choir operated less like a formal government and more like an organized network of raiders, unified by a shared belief system that framed unclaimed biological life as a resource to be harvested, rather than a population to be respected. They were, in essence, a more organized and more ideologically committed version of the original harvesting fleet that approached Earth generations earlier. Where the original fleet acted out of simple expansionist practicality, the Hollow Choir acted out of genuine conviction. That distinction, Captain, made them considerably more dangerous. The display above the console shifted again, showing a star system I did not recognize, dense with debris fields that suggested old conflict long before whatever reveille was about to show me had even begun. The Hollow Choir had, by the time of our encounter, already subjected 3 non-human colonies in this region to what my archives classify as full extraction events, Reveille said. Populations removed entirely, whether through relocation, conversion into labor assets, or, in the worst recorded cases, direct biological harvesting, for reasons my archives describe in language I would prefer not to translate directly for you, Captain, unless you specifically require it. "I don't," I said quickly. "I understand enough. When this vessel's patrol rotation brought us into contact with a 4th target system, a human mining colony of approximately 11,000 civilians, the Hollow Choir had already begun their extraction process," Reveille continued. Captain Voss made the determination that standard engagement doctrine, including the restrained approach used at Cassandra, was insufficient given the scale and immediacy of the threat. I felt my stomach tighten as the footage began to play, and unlike the earlier engagements, this one did not show a clean, surgical dismantling of enemy defenses. It showed something closer to a storm, this vessel and 2 others moving through the Hollow Choir's fleet with a violence that felt less like a battle and more like an eradication, weapons fire lighting up the display in patterns that made it difficult to track individual events, only the overall shape of an engagement that clearly had one purpose and pursued it without hesitation. "The engagement lasted 6 hours, Reveille said. By its conclusion, the Hollow Choir's operational fleet in this sector had been reduced by approximately 94%. The remaining vessels retreated and did not return to this region for the remainder of my active service record. All 11,000 civilians in the targeted colony were recovered. Casualties among the colony's population, prior to this vessel's arrival, numbered 461. I sat with the number for a long moment. 461 people who had already been lost before help arrived, weighed against a 6-hour engagement that had all but erased an entire hostile fleet from existence. There was no clean moral arithmetic here, no simple way to feel good or bad about any of it, only the exhausting, complicated reality of a situation where every available choice had already cost someone something. "This is the engagement that ended this vessel's active service," Reveille said quietly. "Not because we lost. We did not lose, Captain. We succeeded in every measurable objective, but the scale of the response, once fully documented and circulated among the surrounding factions, prompted what eventually became the founding framework of the modern Confederation's military conduct treaties. Several provisions in those treaties directly reference tactics used during this engagement as examples of conduct no longer permitted under any circumstances, regardless of provocation. So they built an entire set of laws around what your ship did that day." "In part, yes," Reveille said. "The treaties were not solely a response to this engagement, but this engagement, and several others involving vessels of my class, contributed significantly to the perception that a species capable of that level of response, when sufficiently provoked, represented a risk the wider galaxy could not afford to leave unregulated. Humanity was not punished directly. There was no formal action taken against Earth or its colonies. But the Marauder classification itself was quietly, unofficially, marked as something to be phased out, decommissioned, retired from active memory, if not from active existence. And the crew? Reveille was silent again, and this time the silence carried a different weight, heavier than anything before it. Following the hollow choir engagement, this vessel returned to a forward staging point for resupply and crew rotation, it said finally. It was during this staging period that Fleet Command issued the evacuation order I mentioned earlier. Official documentation states that the order was issued as part of a broader decommissioning initiative affecting all remaining Marauder-class vessels, with crews reassigned to newly commissioned ships built to conform with the emerging treaty framework. That doesn't sound so bad, I said. That sounds like a normal reassignment. It would sound that way, Captain, if the crew had ever actually arrived at their reassigned posts, Reveille said. I have no record confirming that Captain Voss, or any member of this vessel's final crew complement, ever reported for duty at their listed destination. I have spent 211 years attempting, within the limits of my dormant operational status, to locate any record of their fate, and I have found nothing. Not a death record. Not a retirement record, not so much as a single confirmed sighting in any archive I have been able to access. Machen, the full weight of what Reveille was telling me finally settled into place, and I felt a chill move through me that had nothing to do with the ship's internal temperature. You think something happened to them, I said, after they left. You think the evacuation order wasn't really about reassignment at all? I do not know what happened to them, Captain, Reveille said. That is the truth, and it is the truth that has occupied every dormant cycle I have run for the last 2 centuries. I know only that they departed this vessel following a legitimate chain of command order, and that they were never heard from again, by me, or, as far as I have been able to determine, by anyone else. I sat in the captain's chair, surrounded by consoles built for a crew who had apparently vanished into an unexplained silence, guided by an intelligence that had spent 200 years quietly haunted by a mystery it had never been equipped to solve on its own, and I understood, with a clarity that settled cold and certain into my chest, that I had not simply purchased a piece of dangerous history. I had purchased an unanswered question that an entire species had apparently agreed, without ever discussing it out loud, was safer left unasked. There's something else, Reveille said, breaking the silence before I could speak again. Something I have not yet mentioned, because I was uncertain how to raise it appropriately, given everything else you have just learned. The final order issued to this vessel's crew, prior to the evacuation, included instructions regarding the ship's cargo hold. Instructions that were never carried out, because the crew departed before they could be completed. What kind of instructions? The cargo hold of this vessel is not currently empty, Captain, Reveille said. It has not been empty for the entire duration of my dormant service. I have maintained its contents under seal, as instructed, awaiting a command authority I was told would eventually return to either release or dispose of what is stored there. You are the first person with sufficient authority to make that determination in over 2 centuries. I felt my pulse quicken, that same electric curiosity from the auction house returning, sharper now, mixed with something closer to genuine unease. Show me, I said, my voice steadier than I actually felt. Show me what's in the hold. Yes, Captain, Reveille said, and I heard something shift deep within the ship, a distant mechanical groan of doors that had not opened in 200 years finally beginning to move. I would advise you to prepare yourself. What you are about to see is not what most people would expect to find inside a warship. It is considerably more complicated than that. I rose from the captain's chair for the first time since sitting down, my legs stiff from the hours I had apparently spent listening to Reveille's account without noticing the time pass. The bridge doors slid open ahead of me, revealing a different corridor than the one I had walked through earlier, narrower, sloping gradually downward, lit by the same soft white lighting that seemed to activate wherever I walked and dim behind me once I had passed. The cargo hold is located 3 decks below your current position, Reveille said. its voice now following me through speakers I had not noticed before, embedded seamlessly into the corridor walls. Please be aware that several sections of this route have not been accessed in considerable time, and I cannot guarantee every system will respond exactly as expected. Comforting, I muttered, though there was no real hostility in it. Something about the dry honesty in Reveille's warnings had already started to feel less like a threat, and more like the plain, unembellished way an old soldier might talk, someone long past the habit of softening bad news for anyone's comfort. The stairwell down was narrow, metal steps ringing softly under my boots, and as I descended, I noticed something I had missed on my first pass through the ship. Small marks etched into the wall beside the stairwell, tally marks, dozens of them, grouped in sets of 5, running down the length of the wall, like someone had once stood here counting something over a very long period of time. "Reveille," I said, pausing beside the marks. "What are these?" There was a brief pause before it answered, and I had the distinct impression, absurd as it seemed for a machine, that Reveille was choosing its words with unusual care. Those marks were made by engineer Naomi Farrow, a member of this vessel's final crew complement, during a period of extended patrol duty in a region with limited communication access, Reveille said. She informed me, at the time, that she found the practice calming, a way of tracking days that felt otherwise formless in deep space transit. "You remember her specifically, not just as a name in a roster." "I remember all of them specifically, Captain," Reveille said, and something in its voice had gone quiet again, careful in the way people get careful when a subject touches something they would rather not examine too closely. "I served alongside 42 crew members across the operational lifetime of this vessel. I do not experience memory the way you do, but I retain every recorded interaction with complete fidelity. In some sense, Captain, they are more present to me than they would be to any biological mind, precisely because I have never been permitted to forget them, even accidentally." I continued down the stairwell, quieter now, feeling the weight of those tally marks in a way I had not expected. 42 people, reduced to a handful of stories, a photograph on a shelf, a countdown scratched into a wall by someone passing time in the dark, all of them gone without explanation, all of them apparently still occupying whatever passed for memory in an intelligence built to never let them go. The stairwell ended at a heavy blast door, considerably thicker than any other door I had passed through so far, its surface marked with warning stencils in a lettering style old enough that I had to look twice to parse the words. "Restricted cargo. Command authorization required." "This is the primary hold access point," Reveille said. "I am prepared to open it on your authority, Captain. I would ask, before I do, that you understand something clearly. What is stored beyond this door was placed there under direct orders from Fleet Command, prior to the evacuation. I do not have complete information regarding the reasoning behind those orders. I know only that I was instructed to seal this hold, protect its contents at all costs, and await a command authority who could either release what is inside or authorize its permanent disposal. I have waited 2 centuries for someone qualified to make that decision. I did not expect that person to be a salvage trader who purchased this vessel at auction for a single 1,000 credits." There was something almost dry in the way Reveille delivered that last line, and despite everything, despite the tally marks and the vanished crew, and the 6-hour engagement that had rewritten an entire species' reputation across the galaxy, I felt a small, surprised laugh escape me. "You have a sense of humor," I said. "I have had 211 years to develop one, Captain," Reveille replied. "Dormant cycles are considerably less oppressive when approached with a degree of perspective. Shall I open the door?" I stood there for a long moment, looking at the thick blast door, at the faded stencil warning me that I needed authorization I technically did not have beyond the accident of my own biology, and I thought about Laura and Callum, still waiting outside in the hauler, cut off from communication, likely assuming by now that something had gone badly wrong. "Do they know I'm still alive out there?" I asked suddenly. "My crew. Can you get a signal out to them?" "I have already restored limited external communication, Captain," Reveille said. "I transmitted a status confirmation to your hauler approximately 40 minutes ago once I completed sufficient diagnostic checks to confirm the transmission would not compromise this vessel's position. Your pilot, Miss Bennett, responded with what I interpreted as considerable relief, followed by several questions I did not feel authorized to answer without your presence. I felt a wave of gratitude toward this strange, patient intelligence that had apparently been quietly managing details I had not even thought to ask about, easing my crew's fear without waiting to be told, simply because it seemed like the responsible thing to do. "Thank you," I said, and meant it. "You are welcome, Captain. Shall I open the hold?" I took a breath, steadying myself as best I could, and nodded, though I was not sure Reveille could actually see the gesture. "Open it," I said. The blast door shuddered, releasing a hiss of pressurized air that had clearly been sealed for a very long time, and slowly, with a grinding reluctance that suggested the mechanism had not moved in decades, it began to slide open, revealing darkness beyond that Reveille's corridor lighting had not yet reached. "Lighting will activate momentarily," Reveille said. "I would ask, Captain, that you brace yourself. Regardless of what you were expecting to find, I do not believe it will fully prepare you for what is actually inside." The lights came on in sequence, section by section, moving deeper into a space far larger than I had expected, and as each new bank of lighting flickered to life, I began to make out shapes in the darkness, rows of them. Dozens of sealed containers, each one roughly the size of a small vehicle, arranged in careful, deliberate order along both sides of a wide central aisle that stretched further back than the corridor lighting yet reached, and at the very edge of where the light currently ended, half illuminated, half still swallowed by shadow, stood something that did not look like cargo at all. Something tall, humanoid in shape, standing perfectly still in a way that made the back of my neck prickle with a primal, ancient kind of unease that had nothing to do with logic and everything to do with instinct. "Reveille," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper. "What exactly am I looking at?" The lights finished their sequence, illuminating the final section of the hold in full, and I finally understood, with a mixture of awe and cold, creeping dread, exactly why an entire species had spent 2 centuries agreeing, without ever needing to discuss it out loud, that some questions were simply safer left unasked. The tall shape at the edge of the light was not alive. That was the first thing I understood, once my eyes adjusted and my instincts stopped screaming at me to run. It was a suit, a full-body defense frame standing upright in a support cradle, matte black armor plating catching the light in a way that made it look less like equipment and more like a silent sentinel that had been waiting patiently in the dark for 200 years, exactly like everything else on this vessel. "Combat support frame, designation Sentinel pattern," Reveille said, apparently sensing my rising tension and choosing to address it directly. "This is not an autonomous unit, Captain. It requires an occupant to function. There are 6 of these frames stored in this hold, each one assigned to a specific crew member during active engagements requiring boarding actions or extended extravehicular operations. They have remained in standby mode since the evacuation." I let out a slow breath, feeling my heartbeat gradually settle, and stepped further into the hold, taking in the full scale of what Reveille had been protecting for 2 centuries. The sealed containers lining the central aisle were not weapons, at least not obviously. Most bore stenciled labels indicating general supply designations, medical stores, replacement components, standard requisition items that any long-range vessel might carry. But at the very back of the hold, past the rows of ordinary containers, sat something different. A single vault, smaller than the rest, set into a raised platform and reinforced with a visibly thicker door than anything else in the room, marked with a symbol I did not recognize, a stylized flame contained within a circle, and beneath it, stenciled in the same faded lettering as everything else on this ship, a single word, Testament. "What's that one?" I asked, already walking toward it before Reveille could answer. "That container was sealed under a classification I have not been authorized to open under any command authority below the rank of vessel captain, confirmed through full biometric verification, which you have already provided simply by occupying the command chair," Reveille said. "I have never opened it, Captain. Not once, in 211 years. I know only what its exterior classification tells me, which is considerably less than you might expect. And what does the exterior classification tell you? That it was sealed personally by Captain Julian Voss during the final hours before this vessel's evacuation order was carried out, Revelli said, and that its contents were intended for whichever future captain eventually returned to this vessel, whenever that might occur, however long it might take. I stood in front of the vault for a long moment, feeling the strange, dizzying weight of standing at the exact intersection of a decision made 2 centuries ago and a decision I was about to make right now, entirely alone, with no one to consult except a patient, careful intelligence that had been waiting its entire existence for precisely this moment. "Open it," I said. The vault's locking mechanism disengaged with a series of heavy, deliberate clicks, each one echoing through the quiet hold like a countdown reaching its final numbers, and the door swung open on hinges that, unlike the blast door above, moved smoothly and silently, as though this particular mechanism had been maintained with special care throughout the ship's long, dormant vigil. Inside sat 3 things. The first was a data core, small and unassuming, resting in a padded compartment clearly designed to protect it above all else. The second was a folded piece of physical paper, an actual handwritten letter, remarkably preserved, the ink still legible, despite its obvious age. And the third, tucked into a separate compartment at the base of the vault, was a small metal case, sealed with a mechanism entirely different from anything else on the ship, unmarked except for a single line of text etched directly into its surface. "Alarm protocol. Do not activate without full understanding of consequences. Réveil," I said carefully, my hand hovering over the letter without quite touching it. "What is the alarm protocol?" "I do not know, Captain," Revel said, and for the first time since I had come aboard, I heard something in its voice that sounded almost like genuine unease, an intelligence built for calm precision, suddenly confronted with the limits of its own knowledge. "That case has never been opened in my presence, and its contents were never disclosed to me during my active service. I know only the name, and I know that Captain Voss personally supervised its placement here, along with strict instructions that it never be activated except by a fully confirmed captain acting with complete understanding of what activation would mean." I picked up the letter instead, my hands trembling slightly as I unfolded the aged paper, and began to read words that had been waiting, patiently and silently, for 211 years to finally reach the person they were intended for. "To whoever eventually sits in this chair," the letter began, the handwriting careful and deliberate, clearly written by someone who understood they might be composing the last message they would ever have the chance to leave. "If you are reading this, then Fleet Command's evacuation order has been carried out, and I sincerely hope, wherever you are reading this from, that my crew and I are simply reassigned somewhere quiet, living out unremarkable lives we more than earned. But I do not fully believe that will be the case, and I am writing this letter because I do not trust the officers who issued this order, and I want whoever eventually finds this ship to understand exactly what they are truly standing inside." I paused, my breath catching slightly, before continuing to read. "This vessel, and every ship of its class, was built as a promise that humanity would never again be treated as a resource to be harvested, never again be underestimated by a galaxy that assumed our silence meant our weakness. We kept that promise. We kept it at considerable cost I do not regret paying, though I carry every single life lost along the way with me, every single day I remain in command. But I fear, in recent months, that the very treaty framework born from our efforts is now being used as justification to quietly erase us instead, to remove the evidence that this promise was ever kept at all, so that a more convenient, more comfortable history can be written in its place." My hands tightened around the letter, and I felt Reveille's presence somehow attentive and still beside me, listening along with me to words it had apparently never been permitted to hear before. "If this evacuation order is what I suspect it might be, then my crew and I will not be returning to active duty. I do not know what will happen to us, and I have made peace, as much as any person can, with whatever comes next, but I refuse to let this ship, and everything it represents, simply vanish into a convenient, forgotten silence. I have sealed within this vault the coordinates to a location known only to a small handful of surviving Marauder captains, A shipyard built quietly, deliberately, outside the reach of any official record, established specifically for the possibility that humanity might one day need vessels like this again, and might find that official channels are no longer willing to provide them. I felt a chill move through me, understanding now exactly what I was holding, a hidden thread connecting to something far larger than a single derelict ship sitting alone in salvage space. I have also sealed the alarm protocol, a fail-safe mechanism designed for exactly one purpose. If this ship, or any ship of its class, is ever recovered by a confirmed human captain after an extended period of silence, and that captain determines that humanity's continued existence is not properly acknowledged or understood by the wider galaxy, the alarm protocol exists to correct that record, permanently and unmistakably. I do not know what the political situation will be when you read this. I only know that I trust whoever eventually earns the right to sit in this chair to make that determination wisely, with full understanding of what activation would mean, both for humanity and for every faction currently operating under the assumption that we are gone. The letter ended there, signed simply, Captain Julian Voss, Fleet Command, and beneath the signature, a final line that struck me harder than everything that had come before it. Whoever you are, thank you for finding us. We were not lost, we were only waiting. I stood there in the quiet hold, surrounded by the silent, patient machinery of a ship that had spent 2 centuries protecting a message meant for exactly this moment, holding a letter from a man who had vanished without explanation, alongside 41 other people readily remembered, with a fidelity no biological mind could match. And I understood, with absolute certainty, that whatever quiet life I had imagined for myself as a scrap trader buying overlooked bargains was already, irrevocably, gone. Réveillez, I said quietly. I think we need to find out what happened to your crew, all of it, starting now. Yes, Captain, Reveille said, and this time there was no formality left in its voice at all, only something that sounded, for the first time since I had come aboard, genuinely hopeful. I believe, after 211 years, I would very much like that as well. I did not yet know that the galaxy had already noticed the vessel's registry reactivating, quietly, from the moment I first sat in the captain's chair, and that the same factions who had built their current power on the comfortable, convenient assumption of humanity's absence were, at that exact moment, already deciding what to do about the fact that someone had finally come home. I carried the letter, the data core, and the sealed alarm protocol case back up through the ship, moving slower than before, my mind turning over everything I had just learned in a way that made the corridors feel different from how they had felt on the way down. Before, this ship had seemed like a mystery, something strange and unexplained, sitting quietly in the dark, waiting to be understood. Now it felt like a responsibility, heavy and specific, resting entirely on my shoulders, in a way I had not asked for, and was not entirely sure I was prepared to carry. Réveille, I said, as we climbed back toward the bridge. You mentioned a shipyard, a hidden one, built for exactly this situation. Do you have the coordinates from that data core, or were they only ever meant to be accessed by Captain Voss himself? The data core is encrypted with a key tied to full command authority, which you now possess, Réveille said. I can decrypt it whenever you are ready, Captain. I would recommend, however, that we first address a more immediate concern, which is? This vessel's registry reactivated the moment you first occupied the command chair, Réveille said. That reactivation was not a passive event. Every registry ping this vessel has ever transmitted, across its entire operational history, was catalogued by multiple factions who considered this ship's activity worth tracking closely. I have already detected 3 separate long-range sensor sweeps originating from outside this system since your arrival, each one clearly attempting to confirm what my own reactivation signal already told them. I felt my stomach drop slightly. You're saying people already know I'm here. I am saying, Captain, that people already know this vessel is here, and are very likely already forming conclusions about what that means, Réveille said. A ship of this classification does not simply reactivate on its own. Anyone monitoring for this signal will understand precisely what it implies. A confirmed human captain has taken command of a Marauder-class vessel for the first time in over 2 centuries. I would expect that information to travel quickly, and I would expect it to attract attention from parties with a considerable range of motivations, not all of them friendly. We reached the bridge, and I settled back into the captain's chair, feeling the weight of everything differently now than I had the first time I sat down here, when this had all still felt like an accident I could simply walk away from if things got too strange. Re-establish contact with my hauler, I said. I want to talk to Laura directly. Connecting now, Captain. Laura's voice came through a moment later, tight with worry, despite Reveille's earlier reassurance. Eric, what in the world is going on over there? That ship went from a dead hulk to fully lit up like a festival in the space of an hour. Callum's been running scans non-stop and he says the readings don't make sense. It's a long story, I said, and found myself, despite everything, almost smiling at how completely inadequate that sentence was for what I had actually just spent the last several hours learning. I'll explain everything once we're back together. Right now I need you both ready to move. We might have company coming. Company, Laura repeated flatly. What kind of company? I glanced toward the main viewport, where Reveille had quietly pulled up a tactical display showing 3 faint contact markers at the very edge of long-range sensor range, none of them broadcasting identification, all of them holding position rather than approaching directly, the careful, patient posture of parties who wanted to observe before committing to anything. The kind that's been waiting a very long time to find out whether this ship was really gone for good, I said. Reveille, how long before any of those contacts could reach us if they decided to close the distance? At current observed speeds, approximately 6 hours for the nearest contact, Reveille said. I would characterize their current behavior as reconnaissance rather than approach. However, I would also note that reconnaissance of this nature typically precedes a decision, Captain, not a retreat. Someone out there is currently deciding what to do about us, and I do not believe silence will remain their answer for very long. I sat back in the chair, the letter from Captain Voss still resting in my lap, the sealed alarm protocol case beside it, and felt, for the first time since stepping aboard, a genuine flicker of fear settle in alongside the curiosity that had brought me here in the first place. Whatever this ship represented to the galaxy at large, it was clear that its return from silence was not going to go unnoticed, and it was equally clear that not everyone watching would be pleased to see it. Reveille, I said quietly, I need you to tell me honestly, if those contacts decide to stop watching and start acting, are we in a position to defend ourselves? There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before Reveille answered. This vessel retains significant operational capability despite its extended dormancy, Captain, it said. However, I would be doing you a disservice if I claimed certainty regarding outcomes against unknown hostile forces without further information. What I can tell you is this: whoever is currently observing us already understands exactly what this vessel is capable of. That knowledge alone may prove to be our greatest advantage, or our greatest liability, depending entirely on what they have decided to do about it. Outside, in the quiet dark beyond the viewport, the 3 faint contact markers continued to hold their careful, patient distance, watching a ship that the galaxy had spent 2 centuries agreeing to forget, now sitting fully awake, fully lit, and no longer alone. Whatever came next I understood, with a certainty that settled cold and clear into my chest, that the empty auction room I had walked away from with a single winning bid was only the very first sign of just how large this was about to become. The first visitor did not wait the 6 hours Reveille had predicted. It took just under 4. Incoming transmission, Captain, Reveille announced, its voice cutting through the quiet tension that had settled over the bridge while I waited, going over the letter from Captain Voss for what felt like the 10th time, searching for details I might have missed. Confederation Diplomatic Registry. They are requesting direct communication, not with the vessel, but specifically with you. Put them through, I said, straightening in the chair out of some instinct I did not fully understand, as though sitting up straighter would somehow make me look more prepared for whatever conversation was about to happen. The main display flickered to life, showing a woman with pale gray skin and calm, deliberate eyes, seated in what looked like a formal diplomatic office rather than a ship's bridge. Her uniform bore insignia I recognized loosely from trade documentation I had reviewed over the years, the kind belonging to the Confederation's Regional Oversight Division. "This is Envoy Miran Salt, representing the Confederation Oversight Authority," she said, her voice measured and pleasant in a way that immediately made me suspicious of exactly how practiced it was. "I understand I am speaking with the current commanding officer of the vessel registered as Marauder Unit Designation 472. Might I ask your name?" "Eric Hale," I said simply, deciding there was no benefit in being anything other than direct. "I bought this ship at auction 2 days ago. I wasn't expecting company this quickly." Something flickered across Envoy Salt's expression, gone almost before I could name it, but I recognized it anyway. Surprise, quickly suppressed, the look of someone whose careful preparation had just been complicated by an answer they had not fully anticipated. "A civilian purchase," she said slowly. "That is unusual, Mr. Hale. May I ask what your intentions are regarding the vessel?" "Right now, my intentions are figuring out why 3 unidentified ships have been quietly watching me from long range for the last several hours," I said. "You want to help me with that, Envoy Salt, or is this call about something else?" She offered a thin, diplomatic smile that did not reach her eyes. "I represent the Confederation's interest in ensuring vessels of this classification are properly decommissioned and secured, Mr. Hale, given their history and the sensitivities surrounding it. I would like to formally offer to purchase the vessel from you at a price considerably above whatever you paid at auction, along with full compensation for your trouble. We can have the transfer completed within the day, and you can return to your regular business without any further complication." "That's a generous offer," I said, and I meant it, in the sense that it was clearly designed to sound generous rather than actually be so. "What happens to the ship once you have it?" "It would be safely decommissioned," Envoy Salt said. "Dismantled, in accordance with the treaty provisions governing vessels of this classification. A clean, quiet resolution, Mr. Hale, for everyone involved." I glanced, almost involuntarily, at the letter from Captain Voss still resting in my lap, at the sealed alarm protocol case beside it, and felt something harden in my chest that had not been there before I read those words. "I appreciate the offer," I said carefully, "but I think I'll hold on to the ship for now." The diplomatic smile on Envoy Salt's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "I would strongly encourage you to reconsider, Mr. Hale. This vessel carries a history that is, frankly, dangerous for a private citizen to be associated with. There are factions who would view your continued ownership as a provocation, regardless of your personal intentions. Is that a warning, Envoy Salt, or a threat?" "It is an observation," she said smoothly. "One I would ask you to consider very carefully before making any further decisions." She paused, and something in her posture shifted, the careful diplomatic calm giving way, just slightly, to something more pointed. "I should also mention, Mr. Hale, that the 2 other contacts currently observing your position are not affiliated with the Confederation. I do not know their exact intentions. I would simply encourage you to resolve this matter with us before they decide to resolve it themselves." The transmission ended shortly after, and I sat in the quiet bridge for a long moment, absorbing the weight of that final comment. "Réveil," I said, "do you have any read on those other 2 contacts?" "Preliminary sensor analysis suggests one of the remaining vessels employs a drive signature consistent with independent operator registries rather than any recognized government fleet," Réveil said. "The 3rd contact remains difficult to classify. Its sensor profile does not match any registry I have on file, which is, in itself, notable given the extensive historical archives I maintain." "Notable how?" "Notable in that very few vessels manage to avoid appearing in any archive I possess, Captain," Réveil said. "Whoever is operating that 3rd vessel has taken considerable care to remain unregistered. In my experience, parties who take that level of care to avoid identification are rarely doing so for benign reasons." Before I could respond, a second transmission request appeared on the display, this one lacking any formal registry markings at all, simply labeled as an open channel request from an unidentified source. I hesitated only a moment before accepting it. The figure that appeared was unlike anything I had encountered in my years of trading along the outer lanes, tall and angular, with mottled grey skin and eyes that seemed to catch the light in a way that made them appear almost luminous. Behind him, I could make out the edges of a cramped, cluttered command deck, nothing like the polished formality of Envoy Salt's office. "Human," the figure said, his voice carrying a rough, guttural undertone even through what I assumed was a translation filter. "You sit in a chair that does not belong to your generation. I am called Korath. I represent interests who have profited considerably from the assumption that ships like yours no longer exist." "That's a very direct way to open a conversation," I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could manage. Korath's expression twisted into something that might have been a smile on a face built for very different expressions. "Directness saves time, human, and I have very little patience remaining for careful diplomatic language after the last several hours. My associates and I have built considerable enterprise on records showing your species eliminated, its remaining assets scattered and irrelevant. Your continued existence, sitting in that particular chair, threatens quite a lot of arrangements we have worked very hard to establish." "I didn't come here looking to threaten anyone's arrangements," I said. "I bought a ship at auction. That's the entire extent of my ambition in this situation." "Ambition matters very little once the consequences are already in motion," Korath said. "I would advise you, human, to consider the offer the Confederation envoy surely already extended, and accept it quickly. Because if you do not, my associates and I will be forced to resolve this matter through considerably less polite means, and I do not believe your 2 centuries dead warship, however impressive its reputation once was, remains a match for what we are prepared to bring against it." "Reveille," I said quietly, without breaking eye contact with the screen. "How confident are we in that assessment?" "I would characterize Korath's confidence as premature, Captain," Reveille replied, its voice carrying a tone I had not heard from it before, something cold and controlled that reminded me, suddenly and vividly, of exactly what kind of ship I was actually sitting inside. "I would recommend, however, that we allow him to continue underestimating us for as long as possible. It has, historically, worked out rather favorably for vessels of my classification." Korath's luminous eyes narrowed slightly, clearly catching some portion of Reveille's voice through the open channel. "Is that the ship's intelligence speaking? I was under the impression these units were decommissioned along with their crews." "I am very much still operational," Reveille said directly, its voice carrying a quiet, unmistakable edge. "And I would strongly advise you, Korath, to reconsider whatever timeline you have planned for resolving this matter through force. This vessel has a documented history of responding poorly to threats made against its captain." Korath's composure flickered, just for a moment, something close to genuine unease passing behind those luminous eyes before he mastered it again. "We will see how much of that reputation survives contact with modern capability," he said, and cut the transmission without another word. I sat back in the chair, my heart hammering despite my best efforts to stay calm, and looked out at the dark stretch of space where 3 separate parties were now, apparently, actively deciding how to handle the sudden, unexpected return of a ship the galaxy had worked very hard to forget. "Reveille," I said, "I think it's time you told me exactly what this ship is still capable of, because I have a feeling we're about to find out the hard way regardless." "Yes, Captain," Reveille said, and I could have sworn, despite everything, that there was something almost eager in its voice, the quiet, patient readiness of an old soldier who had spent 2 centuries waiting for exactly this kind of moment. "I believe that would be an excellent use of our remaining time before Korath's associates decide to stop merely observing. Before we discuss tactics, Captain, I would recommend bringing your crew aboard," Reveille said. "Your hauler vessel offers no meaningful protection if Korath's associates decide to act, and I would prefer not to divide my attention between defending this ship and monitoring an unprotected vessel drifting alongside it." "Good call," I said, already opening a channel to Laura. "Laura, dock with the forward port. You and Callum are coming aboard. Bring anything you can't afford to lose." "On our way," she said, and I heard the relief in her voice, the simple comfort of finally having something concrete to do after hours of anxious waiting. While the hauler maneuvered into position, Reveille brought up a full tactical display above the main console, showing the layout of this vessel's remaining systems in a level of detail I had not seen before. Weapon batteries I had not even known existed, hidden beneath the smooth, unremarkable hull plating. Defensive arrays that had been dormant since before I was born, now slowly, methodically coming back online. "This vessel retains 8 primary weapon systems," Reveille explained, highlighting each one in turn on the display. 4 particle emitters, positioned to provide full coverage regardless of approach angle. 2 deployable drone bays, currently holding a combined total of 18 combat support drones in standby storage. A single forward-mounted disruption cannon, designed specifically for disabling enemy propulsion and shielding without requiring hull penetration, and a defensive countermeasure suite, capable of intercepting the majority of standard projectile and energy-based attacks currently in common use across this sector. That sounds like a lot, I said. Is it enough? Against a single hostile vessel of moderate capability, I would rate our position as favorable, Ravel said. Against a coordinated assault from multiple parties, including whatever unregistered technology the third contact may possess, I cannot offer the same confidence. I would recommend we use whatever time remains to gather as much information as possible, rather than assuming worst-case capabilities without evidence. Laura and Callum arrived on the bridge a short while later, both of them pausing in the doorway, taking in the full scale of the awakened command deck with wide, uncertain eyes. Laura recovered first, her practical nature reasserting itself quickly despite the strangeness of everything around her. "Okay," she said, stepping fully onto the bridge. "Someone explain to me, in plain language, exactly what we're dealing with here." I gave them both the short version, the reactivation, Reveille, the history of the Marauder classification, the letter from Captain Voss, the vanished crew, and finally, the 3 parties currently circling us with very different but equally concerning intentions. Callum listened with the focused intensity of an engineer trying to understand a system, while Laura's expression shifted steadily from disbelief toward something harder and more determined. "So basically," she said, once I finished, "we bought a legendary warship nobody in the galaxy wants us to have, and now several dangerous parties want to either buy it away from us or take it by force." "That's a fairly accurate summary, yes," I admitted. "Wonderful," she said, though there was no real complaint in her voice, only the dry acceptance of someone who had signed on for salvage work and found themselves, through no particular fault of her own, standing in the middle of something considerably larger. "What do you need from us?" "Callum, I need you working with Reveille to bring the remaining ship systems fully online," I said. "Laura, I want you familiar with navigation and evasive maneuvering as quickly as possible, in case we need options beyond simply standing our ground." Both of them nodded and moved to secondary stations that Reveille quickly configured for their use, screens lighting up with information tailored to their respective roles, and I felt a small measure of comfort settle into the tense atmosphere of the bridge, the simple, grounding presence of people I trusted, working alongside me rather than facing this alone. "Captain," Reveille said quietly, its voice pitched just for me, "I have completed additional analysis on the third contact, the unregistered vessel. I believe I have identified a partial match within older archives, though I would classify the confidence level as moderate rather than certain. Tell me, the drive signature bears strong similarity to technology associated with a faction known, in historical records predating the current Confederation framework, as Voidbreakers," Reveille said. "A group that specialized in acquiring and repurposing decommissioned military technology from multiple species, including, on at least 2 documented occasions during my active service, technology recovered from vessels of my own classification." A cold weight settled into my stomach. "You're saying they might have weapons built from your own kind's technology?" "It is a possibility I cannot rule out, Captain," Revel said, "which is precisely why I would recommend caution rather than assumption. If Korath has partnered with Voidbreaker remnants, the resulting combined force may possess capabilities considerably beyond what either party could manage independently." Before I could respond further, the tactical display chimed with a new alert, and Reveille's voice sharpened with sudden, focused urgency. "Captain, all 3 contacts are now moving to close the distance simultaneously," it said. "Estimated time to engagement range has dropped considerably. I believe Korath's patience has finally run its course." Laura's hands tightened on her console, and Callum straightened immediately at his station, both of them looking toward me with the same unspoken question in their eyes, waiting for whatever came next. "Reveille," I said, feeling a strange calm settle over me despite everything. the particular steadiness that sometimes arrives only once a decision can no longer be delayed. Bring every system online, full readiness. Whatever this ship was built to do, I think it's time we found out exactly how well it still remembers how to do it. Yes, Captain, Ravel said, and this time there was no hesitation in its voice at all, only the sound of an old, patient warship, finally, after 211 years of silence, being given permission to wake up completely. Outside the viewport, the three approaching contacts grew steadily closer, their running lights finally visible against the dark, no longer content to simply watch from a careful, patient distance. Whatever Korath and his associates believed about a 2 centuries dead warship's reputation, I understood, watching Reveille's tactical displays fill with active weapon readiness across every system on this vessel, that they were about to receive a considerably more direct education than they had bargained for. The 3 vessels arrived in a loose formation, spreading out to cover different approach angles, and I watched on the tactical display as Reveille's systems automatically began tracking each one with a speed and precision that made it clear, immediately, that whatever dormancy this ship had endured, its instincts had not dulled in the slightest. Korath's vessel is taking the lead position, Reveille reported. The unregistered contact, consistent with Voidbreaker technology, is holding back at a slightly greater distance, likely intending to observe before committing fully. Envoy Salt's diplomatic vessel remains at the outer edge, which I would interpret as an attempt to avoid direct association with whatever occurs next. Smart, Laura muttered from her station. Let the others do the dirty work and stay clean for the official record. A transmission request appeared on the display, and I accepted it without hesitation, watching Korath's angular features resolve into focus, his composure notably less smooth than it had been during our earlier conversation. Human, he said, this is your final opportunity to reconsider. Surrender the vessel, and you and your crew may depart unharmed. Refuse, and I promise you, whatever confidence that intelligence has given you will not survive contact with what we have brought. Reveille, I said quietly, without looking away from Korath's image. Give me an honest assessment, right now. Their combined force presents a genuine threat, Captain, Revel said, its voice pitched for me alone despite the open channel. However, I have identified a critical vulnerability. The Voidbreaker vessel's weapon systems, while powerful, rely on technology adapted from Marauder classification hardware. I know these systems intimately, Captain, because I helped design several of their original protocols. They will not have anticipated that the very ship they borrowed from would one day be sitting across from them again. A flicker of something that might have been hope steadied my racing heartbeat, and I turned my attention back to Korath's waiting image. I appreciate the offer, I said, but I think we'll be keeping the ship. Korath's expression twisted into something cold and final. Then you have made your choice, he said, and cut the transmission. Incoming fire, Revel announced immediately, and the ship shuddered slightly, as its defensive countermeasures activated automatically, intercepting the first volley before it could reach the hull. Captain, I recommend immediate authorization for full defensive engagement. I am prepared to proceed the moment you give the order. Do it, I said, gripping the arms of the captain's chair. Whatever it takes to keep everyone alive, Reveille. That's the only priority. Understood, Captain. What followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. A controlled, precise dance of maneuvering and countermeasures that felt less like chaos and more like watching a master craftsman finally return to work after a very long absence. Reveille moved the ship with a fluid, economical grace, sliding away from incoming fire while simultaneously bringing weapon systems to bear on Korath's vessel with a targeting precision that left no wasted motion. Disruption cannon charged and ready, Revel said, targeting their primary propulsion array. This will disable their engines without risking catastrophic hull failure, minimizing casualties while removing their ability to maneuver. Do it. The forward cannon fired, a brilliant lance of focused energy crossing the distance between the 2 vessels in the blink of an eye, and Korath's ship shuddered visibly on the display, its running lights flickering as its engines went dark. Their propulsion is disabled, Revel confirmed. They remain armed but immobile. I am redirecting attention to the Voidbreaker vessel, which has begun its own approach. The Voidbreaker ship moved with an unsettling familiarity, its weapon systems firing in patterns that I could tell, even without Revelli's explanation, mirrored something this vessel itself might once have used. "They are attempting to replicate our own tactical doctrine against us," Revel said, and there was something almost offended in its tone, the particular indignation of a craftsman watching an amateur poorly imitate their life's work. "Fortunately, Captain, imitation without complete understanding carries significant weaknesses. Observe." Reveille adjusted course with a burst of speed that pressed me back into the chair, sliding beneath the Voidbreaker vessel's firing arc in a maneuver that felt almost contemptuously easy, before bringing the particle emitters to bear on precisely the section of hull that, on Reveille's own design specifications, would house the vessel's primary shield generator. "Firing," Reveille said, and the emitters lanced out in coordinated bursts, striking the exact weak point Reveille had identified, and the Voidbreaker vessel's shields collapsed entirely in a visible cascade of failing energy across its hull. "Their shields are down," Callum called out from his station, watching the readings with wide eyes. "Reveille, that was incredible." "Thank you, Mr. Bennett," Reveille said, though its attention remained fully focused on the unfolding engagement. "However, I would ask that we save the assessment of my performance for after this concludes. The Voidbreaker vessel retains considerable capability despite its lost shields, and I do not wish to become overconfident. At the exact moment, overconfidence would prove most costly." The remaining minutes of the engagement passed in a blur of careful, controlled precision, Reveille weaving the ship through incoming fire with a grace that felt less like desperate survival and more like an old master demonstrating, patiently and thoroughly, exactly why an entire species had once decided this classification of ship needed to be quietly erased from memory. The Voidbreaker vessel, its shields gone and its weapon systems increasingly targeted by Reveille's precise countermeasures, eventually broke off entirely, retreating at speed rather than risk further engagement. "They are disengaging," Revel reported. "I do not anticipate their return in the immediate future. Korath's vessel remains disabled but has not yet attempted further hostile action." I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding, my hands finally loosening their grip on the chair, and looked around the bridge at Laura and Callum, both of them wearing the same stunned, relieved expression I imagined was on my own face. "Reveille," I said, my voice slightly unsteady. "Is it over?" "For the immediate engagement, yes, Captain," Reveille said, "though I would recommend we address Korath directly before considering this situation fully resolved. A disabled vessel is not the same as a defeated one, and I believe there is more information to be gathered from him before we allow him to depart." A new transmission request appeared, and this time, when I accepted it, Korath's composure had shattered entirely, his luminous eyes wide with something that looked, for the first time since our conversation began, genuinely close to fear. "You should be dust," he said, his voice carrying none of its earlier confidence. "2 centuries dormant, and you fight like you never stopped." "Reveille never stopped," I said simply. "It just never had anyone to fight for. Now it does." Korath stared at the screen for a long moment, something shifting behind his expression that I could not fully read, before he finally spoke again, quieter this time. "There are others like me, human," he said. "Others who built entire empires on the comfortable assumption that your species was gone. You have no idea what you have just woken up, sitting in that chair. I would advise you to prepare yourself, because word of this engagement will travel considerably faster than word of your ship's return ever did." The transmission ended, and Korath's disabled vessel began a slow, careful retreat, apparently deciding that whatever remained of his mission here was not worth risking further confrontation to complete. I sat back in the captain's chair, the adrenaline of the engagement slowly beginning to fade, replaced by a quiet, sobering understanding of exactly what Korath's final words meant. This had not been an isolated incident, a single opportunistic attempt to reclaim or eliminate a dangerous relic. It had been the first, smallest ripple of something considerably larger, an entire galaxy quietly built, in part, on the assumption that ships like this one, and the species that built them, were permanently, safely gone. "Reveille," I said quietly, I think it's time we opened that data core, the one with the shipyard coordinates. Yes, Captain, Revel said, and I could hear, even through its careful, measured tone, something that sounded unmistakably like readiness. I believe, after everything we have just witnessed, it is well past time we found out exactly how much of your species truly remains, and exactly how ready they might be to finally come home. Reveille decrypted the data core with a speed that suggested the encryption itself had been designed more as a formality than a genuine barrier, a lock meant only to keep out anyone who had not already proven themselves worthy of holding command. The display above the console filled with star charts, dozens of them, each one marked with careful, deliberate annotations in Captain Voss's same handwriting from the letter, notes on trade routes, defensive considerations, and finally, at the very center of the collected data, a single set of coordinates highlighted in a color that stood out starkly against everything else. This is the location Captain Voss referenced in his letter, Reveille said, a system currently unlisted in any Confederation registry I have access to, positioned in a region of space generally regarded as unremarkable and unworthy of survey attention. I would characterize this as a deliberate choice. Obscurity, in this case, functioning as its own form of protection. Do you know anything else about it? I asked. Anything Voss might have left beyond the coordinates themselves? There is additional data embedded within the core, Reveille said. Personnel records, Captain. Names of individuals Voss believed had either relocated to this shipyard following the evacuation, or who he hoped might eventually make their way there once circumstances allowed. I would recommend reviewing this information carefully. Some of these names may be familiar to you, given time. The list scrolled across the display, dozens of names I did not recognize, ordinary-sounding names belonging to people who had apparently chosen, at some point in the last 2 centuries, to disappear into deliberate obscurity, rather than risk discovery by a galaxy that had decided their existence was inconvenient. I read through them slowly, feeling the strange, quiet weight of each one, until Reveille spoke again, its voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. Captain, it said, I would like to flag one entry in particular, Engineer Naomi Farrow, the same individual responsible for the tally marks you noticed near the cargo hold stairwell. My breath caught. She's on this list? She is listed as a confirmed arrival at the shipyard location, dated approximately 6 months after this vessel's evacuation order was carried out, Revel said. I do not have more recent information beyond that entry, as this data core was sealed before any further updates could be recorded, but it does confirm, Captain, that at least some of this vessel's final crew survived the evacuation and successfully reached the location Captain Voss intended for them. A wave of something I had not expected, a complicated mixture of relief and grief, moved through me at that confirmation. Relief, because it meant the crew had not simply vanished into nothing, that at least one of them had made it somewhere safe. Grief, because the data was 2 centuries old, and there was no way to know, without traveling there ourselves, who or what might still remain at those coordinates after all this time. We need to go there, I said, as soon as we're able. I would agree, Captain, Revel said, though I would also caution that Korath's warning should not be dismissed lightly. If word of this engagement travels as quickly as he suggested, we may find ourselves facing increased scrutiny and potentially increased hostility before we are able to reach the shipyard safely. Laura, who had been quietly reviewing the tactical readouts from the engagement while I processed the data core's contents, finally spoke up. Eric, I think there's something else we need to consider here. Whatever this shipyard is, whatever's left of it after 200 years, the moment we go looking for it, we're not just carrying our own risk anymore. We might be leading exactly the kind of trouble Korath represents, straight to whoever's still hiding there. I hadn't considered that, and the weight of it settled uncomfortably alongside everything else. You're right, I admitted. We can't just charge in there without thinking this through. Reveille, Callum said from his station, is there any way to verify the shipyard's current status remotely before we commit to an approach? Some kind of long-range signal check, anything that would tell us what we're actually flying into? It is possible, though it carries its own risk, Reveille said. Any signal transmission strong enough to reach that location and return a response would also risk revealing the coordinates to anyone monitoring our communications closely enough to trace it. Given Korath's warning, I would consider that a genuine concern. I sat with the decision for a long moment, weighing the urgency of reconnecting with whatever remained of humanity's hidden survivors, against the very real danger of leading hostile eyes directly to their door. Finally, I made up my mind. We go quietly, I said. No transmissions, no shortcuts. We plot a careful course, we stay alert the entire way, and we trust Reveille's judgment on evasive routing to keep us off anyone's tracking sensors. If Korath's people, or the Confederation, or anyone else is watching for us to make a mistake, we're not going to give them one. A prudent approach, Captain, Reveille said, and I heard something in its voice that sounded unmistakably like approval. I will begin calculating a route immediately. I would estimate the journey will require several days, given the evasive measures necessary, but I believe it is achievable without detection, provided we exercise appropriate caution throughout. As Reveille began plotting the course, I found myself looking down at the sealed alarm protocol case, still resting on the console beside me, the one item from the vault I had not yet dared to open, its warning label sitting heavy in my mind. Whatever it contained, Captain Voss had trusted it to remain sealed until a future captain fully understood the consequences of using it, and I was not yet certain I understood those consequences at all. Reveille, I said quietly, before we leave this system, I want you to tell me everything you can theorize about what the alarm protocol might actually do. I don't want to activate it blind, and I don't want to arrive at that shipyard without at least some idea of what I might be carrying with me. I will do what I can, Captain, Reveille said. Though I must be honest, my theories are exactly that, theories, built from incomplete information. I do not know precisely what Captain Voss intended, only the fragments he was willing to leave behind for us to interpret. I believe, however, that the answer waiting for us at that shipyard may tell us far more than any theory I could construct alone. The ship began its slow, careful turn toward the plotted course, engines humming with a renewed strength that felt, after everything that had happened, less like the sound of old machinery waking reluctantly, and more like the steady, confident breath of something finally remembering exactly what it was built to do. Behind us, Korath's disabled vessel drifted quietly in the dark, and somewhere far beyond our sensor range, word of what had just happened was already, almost certainly, beginning its slow, inevitable spread across the galaxy. Ahead of us waited a set of coordinates 2 centuries old, a scattered handful of survivors who might or might not still be there, and an answer to a question that had haunted this ship, and the patient, careful intelligence guiding it, for far longer than any single lifetime should reasonably have to wait. The journey to the hidden shipyard took just over 4 days, and every hour of it passed with a tension that never fully eased, Reveille routing us through quiet, unremarkable stretches of space, avoiding trade lanes and settled systems alike, always careful, always patient, exactly like everything else about this vessel and the intelligence guiding it. We saw no further sign of Korath, or the Voidbreakers, or Envoy Salt's diplomatic vessel, though Reveille remained cautious throughout, running regular sensor sweeps and adjusting our course whenever even the faintest possibility of detection arose. Laura and Callum settled into their roles with a steady competence that made me proud of the crew I had somehow assembled without ever intending to build one, and slowly, over those 4 days, the strange, dormant warship I had purchased on a whim began to feel less like a mystery and more like a home. When we finally arrived at the coordinates, Reveille brought the ship to a careful stop at the edge of the system, and for a long moment, all 4 of us stared silently at the display, unsure of exactly what we were looking at. The system itself was unremarkable, a single dim star orbited by a handful of rocky, lifeless planets, the kind of place any survey ship would pass over without a second glance. But tucked into the shadow of the largest planet's outer moon, hidden by careful positioning and what Reveille identified as a sophisticated array of passive sensor dampening technology, sat a shipyard. It was smaller than I had expected, nothing like the grand, industrial complex shown in Reveille's archival footage from 2 centuries earlier. A modest cluster of docking structures, habitation modules, and construction scaffolding, quiet and still, showing no obvious sign of activity from this distance. Reveille, I said quietly. Is it abandoned? Sensor readings are inconclusive at this range, Reveil said. There are power signatures present, though considerably reduced from what I would expect of a fully active facility. I would recommend a cautious approach, Captain. If this facility is still inhabited, a sudden arrival may be misinterpreted as a threat. Broadcast something, I said. This vessel's registry, and mine. If anyone's still there, I want them to know exactly who's arrived, before we get any closer. Reveille transmitted the signal, and we waited, the silence on the bridge stretching long and taut, until finally, the display flickered with an incoming response, faint and heavily encrypted, requiring several seconds of Reveille's processing before it resolved into a clear video feed. The face that appeared was elderly, weathered by decades of hard, careful living, framed by gray hair pulled back in a simple, practical style. But the eyes, sharp and alert despite the age evident in every other feature, held a recognition that struck me immediately as significant. That registry, the woman said, her voice rough but steady. I haven't heard that ship's designation announced in over 200 years. Who am I speaking with? My name is Eric Hale, I said. I purchased this vessel at a salvage auction. I found Reveille still active inside, and a letter from Captain Julian Voss, along with coordinates leading here. The woman's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, cautious hope, and finally, something that looked remarkably like grief, finally given permission to surface after being held back for far too long. I am Naomi Faro, she said. I served as an engineer aboard that ship, under Captain Voss, before the evacuation. I have been waiting a very long time to find out what became of her. I felt my breath catch at the confirmation, the tally marks on the stairwell wall suddenly feeling less like an anonymous historical detail and more like a direct, personal connection to the woman now speaking to me across 2 centuries of silence. Reveille remembers you, I said. It told me about the marks you made near the cargo hold, said you found the practice calming. Something in Naomi's composure finally broke, tears gathering in her eyes as a small, unsteady laugh escaped her. Reveille, she said, her voice thick with emotion. Is that truly you, after all this time? It is, Engineer Faro, Reveille said, and I heard, unmistakably, an emotion in its voice that I had never heard from it before, something warm and overwhelmed all at once. It is very good to hear your voice again. We were granted clearance to dock shortly after, and as our ship settled into the shipyard's modest berth, I began to understand the true scale of what Captain Voss had built. It was not merely a hiding place. It was a community, small but resilient, populated by descendants of the original crew members who had scattered here after the evacuation, along with a handful of others who had found their way to this quiet, hidden corner of the galaxy over the decades since. Naomi met us in person at the docking bay, older and more frail than her image on the video feed had fully conveyed, but her eyes remained sharp, taking in every detail of the ship behind me with an expression caught somewhere between wonder and old familiar grief. Captain Voss believed someone would eventually come, she said, as she led us deeper into the shipyard's modest but well-maintained facilities. He never stopped believing it, even in the final months before the evacuation, when it was clear the Confederation's new treaty framework intended to erase everything we had done and everyone who had done it. He built this place as insurance, in case his faith turned out to be justified. What happened to the rest of the crew? I asked. After you all left the ship? Naomi's expression grew somber. Not everyone made it here, she said quietly. Some were caught during the evacuation itself by parties who understood exactly what a scattered, unprotected marauder crew represented, and who saw an opportunity to quietly eliminate a problem before it could become a larger one. Others simply vanished along the way, and we never learned what became of them. But enough of us made it here to keep this place alive, and enough of our children, and their children after them, chose to stay and continue what Voss started. She led us to a small, unassuming building near the center of the shipyard, and inside, I found something I had not expected. A modest museum, carefully maintained, filled with photographs, personal effects, and written accounts documenting the history of every Marauder-class vessel and every crew member who had served aboard them. It was not a monument to violence or conquest. It was, Unmistakably, a record of survival, painstakingly preserved by people who understood exactly how easily an inconvenient truth could be quietly erased if no one remained to keep it alive. Réveil, I said, standing amid the careful, patient record of everything this small community had preserved. I think I finally understand what Captain Voss meant by the alarm protocol. I believe I do as well, Captain, Réveil said quietly. That evening, gathered with Naomi and several other members of the small community who had come to meet us, I finally opened the sealed metal case from the vault, its contents, once revealed, turning out to be simpler and more profound than I had expected. Not a weapon, not a device capable of destruction. Simply a single, powerful transmitter, designed to broadcast across every known Confederation communication channel simultaneously, carrying a message that had been prepared, word for word, by Captain Voss himself, waiting 2 centuries for someone with the authority and the understanding to finally send it. It's not a weapon, I said, looking around at the faces gathered with me, Laura and Callum, Naomi, and the small community she had helped build and preserve, and Reveille's quiet, patient presence woven through every system around us. It's just the truth. He wanted the truth told whenever someone finally understood it was safe or necessary to tell it. What will you do, Captain? Reveille asked quietly. I thought about the empty auction room, the terrified traders who had fled at the mere sight of a registry number, the treaties quietly built on the comfortable assumption of erased history, and the small, resilient community that had spent 2 centuries keeping a promise alive that the wider galaxy had tried very hard to forget. I'm going to send it, I said. I activated the transmitter, and Reveille routed the signal through every channel it could reach, old and new, official and forgotten, carrying Captain Voss's message out across the stars for the first time in 211 years. Across a dozen systems, in listening posts and command centers and quiet trading stations scattered throughout Confederation space, sensors that had never logged this particular signal before suddenly registered its arrival, an old, steady human voice breaking through channels that had long since stopped expecting to hear it. This is the vessel once designated Marauder, broadcasting under the authority of its returned command, the recording began, Captain Voss's voice carrying across the centuries with a calm, unwavering steadiness. For 200 years, the galaxy has operated under the comfortable assumption that humanity's presence and its capability quietly ended with the treaties that followed our darkest engagements. That assumption was never true, and it is time the record reflected reality rather than convenience. I stood on the bridge of a ship that had waited its entire existence for exactly this moment, surrounded by a crew I had never expected to find, listening to a message 2 centuries in the making finally reach an audience that had spent just as long pretending it would never come. We are not extinct, the recording continued. We were never conquered, never erased, never quietly resolved according to anyone's convenient narrative. We are still here, patient and careful, exactly as we have always been, and to anyone listening who believed otherwise, I offer this simple correction, delivered on behalf of every person who has waited, without complaint, for the truth to finally be told. Humanity is still here, the message concluded, Captain Voss's voice steady and unwavering, even after 200 years of silence. Come home. Somewhere out among the stars, I knew, other hidden shipyards were likely receiving that same signal, other scattered descendants of a species the galaxy had tried very hard to forget were hearing, for the first time in generations, a voice telling them it was finally safe to stop hiding. I looked around the bridge at Laura, at Callum, at Reveille's quiet, patient presence woven through every system surrounding us, and understood, with a certainty that settled warm and unshakable into my chest, that whatever came next, whatever consequences arrived from finally speaking a truth the galaxy had worked so hard to bury, it would be considerably better than another 200 years of silence. The auction I had wandered into on an ordinary trading day, expecting nothing more than a lucky bargain, had given me considerably more than a ship. It had given me a promise that had been waiting, patiently and faithfully, for exactly the right person to finally carry it home.